Thanks. Thanks a lot, Count Corla. The housing crisis is not a result of the system breaking down, but of the system working as intended. That's unfortunately precisely what is happening in this country. It's as described by Peter Marcuse, the author of In Defence of Housing, because it's a global phenomenon that housing has become commodified, that faceless vultures are able to comb the globe in search of so-called yield, in search of profit maximisation. And their right to profit takes precedence over the right of workers to a home. That's what's at the essence of all of the various facets of the housing crisis that we face. It's encapsulated right here with the sentiment of the government saying that they think the maximum that can be allowed by the Constitution, without asking the question, well, should the Constitution not then be changed? But that one landlord or one vulture's right to maximise their profits takes precedence over the right of 9 families to a home. That's it, in black and white, what the government's position is. Even beyond that, of course, that if the landlord or the vulture fund is able to show that they would make more than 20% extra by selling with vacant possession, that even that provision goes out the window and their right to a profit takes precedence over the right of 10, 15, 20, 100 families' right to a home. And it's a worldwide phenomenon. In New York, for example, you have the greatest housing crisis since the Great Depression. In no state in the US today can a full-time worker on the minimum wage afford to rent a one-bed apartment, exactly the same as exists in this city right now. Globally, over 1 billion people cannot afford to have a home. And there is no greater indictment of capitalism as a system where 8 people have more wealth than the bottom half of humanity combined, and the system cannot afford to give over 1 billion people a home. And the answer to the housing crisis is to turn all of that on its head, to say that people's rights come before the rights of companies, of banks, of landlords, etc., to profit, that people should not be evicted because of vulture funds, landlords or banks wish to maximise their profit, that people should have a right to a home, and that good quality public housing should be provided. And that's the key significance, in my opinion, of Apollo House. A public intervention in housing, by housing campaigners, by people faced with homelessness, by trade unionists, by artists, etc., pointing out in real terms that the state has the resources in the form of NAMA, for example, in terms of land resources, in terms of financial resources, to deal with the housing crisis. It was an unapologetic act of civil disobedience, which said it's better to break the law than to break the homeless. It was a broadly popular act, 4,000 people volunteering to help, over €160,000 donated by people, because it spoke to the feelings of people across the country that there must be something better that can be done about housing. There must be the resources, they must exist in our society now to resolve and eliminate the housing crisis. It was an act that spoke against the government's approach, but the whole neoliberal orthodoxy, the trickle-down theory of housing supply that the government promotes. And it was therefore a highly subversive act. And with such a subversive act, there's a response by the establishment. There's 2 types of responses in general by the establishment. The first is to try to neuter it, to pretend to take it on board, to treat it as an act of charity. It was summed up by the approach of Minister Darragh Murphy, who said that people are right to take action, like in Apollo House, but that the government is already aware of the homelessness crisis and is making efforts to tackle it. Well, in that case, the question has to be put up to Minister Coveney. When are you going to follow through on the 7 agreements that were made with the Home Sweet Home campaign, which they say haven't been met yet? The second approach is to demonise, is an attempt to discredit the campaign, to show that there's only hypocrisy all around, that there's nothing positive that can be done about the issue of housing. And so the Irish Independent attack a leading activist on the spurious basis of the job that her mother happened to have. The Mail on Sunday joined in this weekend with a front-page story, again attacking Apollo House and Home Sweet Home. But worse, far lower, far more disingenuous was the attack unleashed by our supposed public broadcaster, RTE, yesterday. An attack aimed at Unite the Union, first and foremost, but in reality aimed at all those who would say that there's an alternative way to provide housing, that people can be guaranteed a right to a home. The story was that Unite sought a social housing exemption for their former headquarters on Merrion Square. And the underlying message was very clear, was unmistakable, that they were hypocrites for protesting on the one hand, for participating in the occupation of Apollo House, but on the other hand seeking a social housing exemption. You want to talk about fake news? Here we go. This was fake news, peddled by RTE, because the truth was that the key point of Apollo House is that we own Apollo House. It's owned, or effectively owned, by NAMA. It's a public building, and that public resources like NAMA should be used to provide housing. The truth was that Unite, it seems, had no legal option but to seek a social housing exemption. And most embarrassingly for RTE, and most discrediting of the approach, is that it emerged, in fact, that Unite had approached Focus Ireland and other housing NGOs, offering precisely to give the building for the provision of homeless services, but it wasn't suitable. So this was a non-story. There was nothing to it whatsoever. And if RTE had waited a day, they would have, for example, had that last piece of information about the offering of the property for homeless services. But that the purpose was to try to damage the campaign, to try to undo the positive image that Home Sweet Home and Apollo House has had, and to undo the message that has been sent out there that something can be done, that collective action can be taken to tackle the housing crisis. Because collective action, including mass civil disobedience, including mass protests, including the organisation of a massive campaign across this country, like we saw in Spain on the question of evictions, that's what can make a difference. That's what can stop evictions happening in this country. That's what can force the use of public resources like NAMA, like ISIF, to provide public housing, and that's what can win for people the right to a home.